Hi, continuing on our explorations in Wi-Fi 8, I want to dwell on something about the new MCS types that have been included. As I've said before, Wi-Fi 8 is not gearing up for higher rates and throughputs, at least in the peak sense, but it has important objectives towards reliability and also throughput improvement at cell edge or outside of the peak numbers. My name is Srikanth and I'm with NanoCell Networks. So if we look at the MCS story, in fact, it has been a checkered story over the sort of standardization evolution. But if we take the latest Wi-Fi 7 802.11be standards, we will notice that these are the different modulation types, the digital modulation types, and these are the coding rates which are available. Of course, we use LDPC for almost all our transmissions, at least for the data side in the higher generation standards. As you can see, there are gaps where we have not used a combination of a certain modulation and a certain coding. Why was this not done? Could be a question raised. As you know, a variety of trade-offs had to be sort of examined. And of course, if you remember, 11B's main focus was extreme high throughput. So most of the focus was on introducing some of the higher modulation techniques with, say, the highest coding rates to give us some high peak rate numbers. But since we are not focusing on that objective in EHT, we are now looking at some other things which could bring advantage, not necessarily in the peak case, but in more realistic usage scenarios. So we are going to examine which entries in some of these sort of tables which have not yet been used, which of them might be useful and why would it be useful? So some data presented during the standardization. This is the spectral efficiency, which is the gold mark for most digital communication, modulation, coding, and other techniques. And this is the MCS level as we saw in 11BE, right? You can see that some of the, you can say, modulation indices do have sort of large spectral efficiency gaps, okay? Some of them, of course, tend to be smaller. So this is like almost walking a big step between these two states, a big step and a slightly smaller step, a slightly smaller step, again another big state and a smaller step, etc. Okay. Of course, this mainly influences something called as rate adaptation. And of course, usually this is an important part which is happening deep within our chipsets, adjusting as we move our relative distances between, say, an access point and a client device. Okay. Deep within many companies, we not only just measure the peak numbers, which could be somewhere here, but also what we call rate versus range, because many real life use cases operating at the peak might not be the sort of usual mode, but we are mostly in between and we are kind of see how we gracefully degrade as we go from the peak numbers downstairs. Okay. So there are some large gaps in the spectral efficiency. So we'll keep that in mind. Can we make those steps a little bit easier in terms of navigation for the rate adaptation and reap some benefits? And the other angle to this is also the sensitivity requirement. As you know, the golden number for a packet error rate, typically when we look at standards, etc., is 10% PER. This could also be factored in some of the rate adaptation logic, which is proprietary inside the chips. You can again see that there are certain MCS jumps where there are large gaps in the sort of SNR gaps for achieving a certain packet error rate. Okay, these again were presented during the standardization. And so the combination of these two facts, there is a bigger jumps in certain places with respect to spectral efficiency. There are big jumps in the sensitivity requirements. So can we use this to figure out how we can bring in some possible intermediate steps which can be useful from both perspectives? So since we are not going after the peak numbers, we want to make Wi-Fi more useful in realistic scenarios for better reliability, better link adaptation, etc., etc. So we are looking at this objective. So what was the result of these two major data points? Was that we haven't specified any new higher order MCS. So we are not going to 8K QAMs or something fancy like that. And we are, remember, trying to use some of the gaps that we saw, and can we provide some intermediate steps in the MCS tables, and without getting to newer modulation. Here we have provided some newer steps, one more newer steps. And what is the benefit? So the benefit is, remember that in the intermediate ranges, you could get, with accurate link adaptation, you could get better reliability and definitely overall throughput across the cell or across the coverage area has been shown by simulations to have some improvement. Remember, peak numbers are not going to increase, but most of us don't necessarily operate at the peak points in the cell. So what we are interested is in the overall coverage area. How is our throughput distributed? Can there be better numbers? And that has been shown in simulations in IEEE contributions to have some benefits. So ultimately, what do we get? So what we have, as you can see from the lowest to the highest, you can see that there have been newer modulations which have been put in between the older modulation states. Okay. So this means that you have, wherever we have identified those large gaps, considering both the spectral efficiency and the sensitivity, we are trying to fill in those gaps. Okay. And so it's going to be an improvement from the overall cell throughput perspective, adding to this sort of reliability and other useful benefits rather than just shouting about the peak rate impacts. Of course, it'll have an impact on the rate adaptation algorithms, but it's an unsung hero in Wi-Fi that the rate adaptation or link adaptation algorithms have been reasonably mature, at least from the major chipset vendors. So I expect that they'll quickly latch on to some of the new possibilities and hopefully pass on the benefits in terms of better rate versus range performances. So hopefully that was useful. Please take a look at our website for other information. And we also offer courses and presentations through Wi-Fi Now. Thank you.